Hello and welcome to Northern Nightmares, your home for nightmare stories through Canada and beyond. I'm your host Andrew, and this is part 2 of the Satanic Panic. Last week I introduced you to Anton LaVey and how he created his Satanism religion. We ended last episode at the start of the 1980s. Now I'm not going to focus on Anton much on this part. For this part we'll be focusing on the Satanic Panic of the 80s. I have a few points that really define this so-called panic. With the height of contemporary Satanism, some people feared the devil was taking over, especially in America. Members of the Christian church believed the devil was making his way through the youth. His touch was mostly seen in music, movies, and other forms of media. However, Satanism was also an excuse to cover up other forms of evil. So for this part, I'm going to tell you about the 80s rock era and the history of the devil in music. We're also going to dive into the famous role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. And lastly, how Satanism was used to cover up pedophilia rings and used in courts of the time. So grab a drink, roll one up, and get ready for these absurd, wacky stories of the Satanic Panic. Throughout human history, songs about the Dark Lord of Hell is probably one of the oldest themes. For this story, let's start at the 1920s, for the blues era was considered devil music. Robert Johnson was famously known to play into this trope. With his song Crossroads Blue, Johnson sings about heading to a crossroads to make a pact with the devil. The deal was for him to become famous. This famous song was recorded and released in 1936. However, after this tune, 2 years later, Johnson died of unknown causes. The myth is the devil came to collect his soul. Supernatural, the TV show, has a whole episode about Johnson. In the show, Johnson makes a deal with a crossroads demon that works for Satan, and it's hellhounds that come to drag his soul to hell. The new movie Sinners, directed by Ryan Coogler, is based on this time in music and involves the story of Robert as well. The myth of Robert Johnson inspired another hit in 1979. The Charlie Daniels Band wrote The Devil Went Down to Georgia, the story of the devil challenging a boy named Johnny in a fiddle contest with the prize of Johnny's soul. Even the famous Elvis Presley was labeled with the involvement of Satan. Parents forbade their children to listen to his music as they thought he was possessed by Satan's dark powers. It's funny too, if you rearrange the letters of his first name, it spells evils. It's wacky to think that people thought this. I mean, you could say in a way he is evil because he did steal music from African American artists like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, but that's just my opinion. In the 1960s, we had the Rolling Stones drop an album titled Their Satanic Majesties, and later another album called Beggar's Banquet with the hit song Sympathy for the Devil. The Beatles also had some controversial involving Satan as well. Their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band featured many faces, including Aleister Crowley, second from the left corner. I was surprised and delighted to find Crowley on the cover, as I own this record on vinyl. Their White Album heavily inspired Charles Manson's ideology of a race war starting, believed it held subliminal messages. He also was deep into Satanism as well. If you listen to my Manson story, you'll remember I dived deep into the White Album into more context. Getting closer to the 80s, AC/DC played into this theme, dropping their album Highway to Hell in '79 with Angus Young wearing the famous devil horns. Also a year later, dropping the Black Album with their hit song Hell's Bells. Serial killer Richard Ramirez left behind an AC/DC hat one time at his crime scene, leading the media to label them as devils. Most notable, a headline called AC/DC Music Made Me Kill at 16, the Night Stalker admits. The Night Stalker was the nickname for Richard Ramirez. It was thought AC/DC stood for Antichrist, Devil's Child. However, one interview at the time, Angus Young seen the letters on his sister's sewing machine, stating it's often seen on electrical devices, meaning power. AC/DC is just two types of electrical currents. As wacky as all this sounds, America was still in the mindset of the 50s. Men worked, women stayed home to attend the homestead, and God's word was law. Other famous bands labeled with deviltry were Led Zeppelin, Kiss, Judas Priest, Van Halen, Dio, and even Black Sabbath. You know I couldn't forget Black Sabbath and the late Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne. This Satanic Panic really took off when the band released their self-titled album. If one were to push play right off the bat, you'd hear rain and church bells ringing. Ozzy sings the lyrics, "Big black shape with eye of fire, telling people their desire. Satan sitting there, he's smiling, watching those flames get higher and higher. Oh no, no, please God, help me." In an interview in the 2000s, Ozzy talks about the origins of the band. He called the hippie era in San Francisco a load of crap. During this time, the band was in Austin, Birmingham, working on music. Tony Lamy, the drummer, came up with the idea to make music to scare people because people love seeing horror movies. Even Ed and Lorraine Warren owned the band's first album, adding it to their collection of haunted objects. Looking at Led Zeppelin, they were thought their name stood for Knights in Satan's Service, helping further the claim that Jimmy Page had bought a house previously owned by Aleister Crowley. Of all the times I've mentioned famous figures or mentions of my previous episodes, Crowley has the most, and I'm announcing it now. A Crowley episode is coming, as it's just as wacky and crazy as Satanism. I even own a Crowley picture on my bookshelf. The band Judas Priest had to defend themselves in court on accusations of subliminal messages hidden throughout their albums. A lot of these bands had similar claims as well. It is believed if you played their album backwards, you could hear the messages about Satan. It was thought that the heavy music of the times was a recruitment tool for Satanists to lure young people into their fold. The idea of subliminal messages, I would say, dates back to Manson and his claims to the White Album of the Beatles. But you know what I think? I think all of this was just a clever marketing trick to get noticed. Hell, Motley Crue put a pentagram on their album Shout at the Devil, claiming it was a fun idea to get noticed. Even Kiss played into the theme with the makeup. Gene Simmons himself called his character the Demon, and having a long Satan-like tongue helped with the character. I believe it was to be noticed because people enjoyed being scared, and they all played into the theme to boost their sales and image. But we all know the fanatics at the time fought against them making these crazy claims, believing to protect their children. Being overprotective caused some of these kids to rebel because they wanted the freedom to express themselves. For the music, this was a way they could connect to their feelings. I don't believe everyone was performing dark magic. I think people were just having fun. It was new and exciting, and people wanted to enjoy the art. It didn't mean they were Satanists. If they did become Satanists, that's awesome. They found something they enjoyed. Hell, my mother listens to this podcast. Last week, I said I'm a Satanist, and she told me she laughed when I said it and told me she wasn't surprised. I've always been different than the social norm, and it's what made me me. Even today, music still plays into the devil theme. Some of my favorites that fit this theme would be Marilyn Manson, Lamb of God, Slipknot, and even Ghost. The Swedish band Ghost have made their own thing around Satan. Lead singer Tobias Forge's character is named Papa Emeritus. He wears a pope's hat with an upside-down cross with a skull painted on his face. The devil in music is nothing new, and it's never going away. But music isn't the only thing that defined this era. There are many news reports and infomercials warning parents of items their youth may possess. A love for this music was one. Others were the Satanic Bible, candles, goblets, pentagrams, knives or daggers, robes, and even a little altar. However, there was one that really brought fear to some, and that was the famous role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, was created by Gary Gygax and David Arneson, first published in 1974 by Tactical Studios Rules, later published by Wizards of the Coast, and in 1997 by Hasbro. It's a tabletop role-playing game considered the first of modern-day role-playing games of today. The game involves mini war games with miniature figures, and players venture into many fantasy settings. Players create their own characters using a character sheet involving abilities, classes, backstory, and even race. Abilities consist of strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. The species race you can choose from are dwarves, elves, and humans, for example. A character class is either a fighter, a rogue, or a wizard. The backstory is usually written by the player to build the origins of their character. The Dungeon Master is the one that controls the game. As they build the story, the others will venture on. The DM is essentially a god, or all being of the game. They dictate what goes on and decide what happens throughout the story. D&D also uses dice as well that determine the outcome of a situation. This can include risky actions like scaling a cliff or picking a lock, for example. Each dice does different things as well. A 20-sided dice determines if a hit to an enemy or an action that your character is performing is effective or not. The higher the number, the better the outcome. The other dice, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12-sided, decide how much damage is done. Also, a character's abilities are also a factor in these situations. Like, for example, if a bard is to fight a monster, well, singing to it probably isn't going to be that effective, but you could persuade it to leave you alone if your charisma is high enough. For battle, it's good to have a character skilled with weapons, where the bard could be skilled with charisma situations. The DM decides as well, with their dice, the outcome of any situation. If a player decides to attack a monster, for example, the DM would decide what that monster would do. This also includes NPCs. NPCs mean non-playable character. Over time, characters can level up throughout the story, making future campaigns easier to tackle, as some storylines get harder and harder. That's a bit of a gist on D&D. I've never played it myself, but from what I've seen, it looks fun. It's a pretend game involving stories. It's not like video games where you control your character. You basically are sitting there with your friends talking about your story. During the Satanic Panic, though, people believed that this was secretly promoting devil worship, witchcraft, murder, and even suicide. In the first editions, there were many drawings of female humanoid-like creatures like harpies and succubi, with naked breasts displayed. Due to these controversies, they were later removed in the second editions. Eventually, by the third editions of the game, the names of devils or demons were later reintroduced. Fans of the games were faced with a lot of social altruism, unfair treatments from other peers or family members, and even false associations to Satanism, regardless of their religious beliefs. A lot of the fans were just nerdy kids that just like imagining themselves in other worlds. It was a form of escapism. The game has been subjected to many rumors claiming players can't separate fantasy from reality, believing some experienced psychotic episodes. Some people couldn't even handle the pressure the world was putting on them, some giving it all up, and others unfortunately disappearing or committing suicide. Like the case of James Dallas Egbert III, he was a student at Michigan State University in the 70s, just your average kid that enjoyed the fantasy of D&D. On August 15, 1979, he had disappeared from his dorm, fleeing to the university's steam tunnels to commit suicide. He consumed a handful of methacholine, but thankfully it never killed him. He woke up the next day in the tunnels, fleeing to a friend's house, and later making his way to New Orleans. The whole story was tied to D&D by the media, believing this was all the work of the satanic game. However, as I read into it, it just sounded like Egbert was stressed from school and the involvement from D&D. The game also was used in another case in 1990 due to the actions of Chris Pratt, to which he murdered his stepfather. Later investigations of the game by various psychologists included nothing harmful comes from playing this. D&D helps people socialize with others on a weekly or bi-weekly meetup, encouraging the youth to make friends and learn how to problem solve, a skill beneficial to one's life. The TV show Stranger Things was based on the game, even in Season 4, heavily playing on the events from the Satanic Panic. Some of the characters were involved with a group called the Hellfire Club, a nod to the real Hellfire Club in the 18th century, where members met up for secretive gatherings and anti-religious activities. Overall, the game was simply just a game, but to Christian families, it was tied directly to Satanism. However, D&D managed to defeat the criticism, and today it's still an immensely popular game. There are even some podcasts and YouTube shows where you can watch people play this game. One of my favorites is Critical Role. It's a high production show with many stars and guest stars. But now it's time for this story to take a turn for the worse as we explore the heinous crimes that use Satanism as an excuse. Trigger warning: if you're not comfortable with things involving sexual assault and adults and children, you might want to skip to the end. The Satanic Panic consisted of over 12,000 unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse, or SRA for short, starting in the 80s in North America and even going to other places of the world by the 90s, and still persisted as of today. This part of the panic started when a publication of Michelle Remembers was about a Canadian psychiatrist, Lawrence Pasdar. His patient and now wife, Michelle Smith, were involved with a controversial and now discredited practice involving recovered memory therapy. This practice would make claims that SRA was done on Smith. The claims arose throughout the U.S. involving acts of physical and sexual abuse to people, claiming it was done in the name of Satan. These allegations involved a conspiracy about a global satanic cult which included people with elite status to which they would abduct children for human sacrifice, pornography, and even prostitution. And yes, before you say it, this does sound like the beginnings of Epstein. I'm not going to dive into Epstein in this episode right now though, but around this time a lot of these groups were popping up, and as I go into it, none of them had to do with Satanism. SRA is highly controversial. This includes its definition, the source to which these allegations, proof, and even the so-called claim that Satanism was even involved. It was used as an excuse to basically lighten sentences and to show that no one was capable of committing these crimes. Only the devil had that power. One analysis of 36 court cases involving sexual abuse to minors within rituals, only 1/4 resulted in convictions. That's only 9 cases. However, these cases had little to do with ritual sexual abuse. A survey was done between 1980 and 1990, and out of 12,000 accusations of ritual or religious abuse, the survey found no traces of any well-organized satanic rings. However, they did find some instances to which the aspects of rituals were secondary to the abuse. It was discovered that this was used to intimidate victims. Daycares were even ensnared in this panic as well. The first was a preschool in Manhattan Beach, California. It was ran by a woman named Virginia McMartin. In 1983, a mother blamed McMartin's grandson of having abused her 2-year-old. During the trials, going off the children's testimony, the mother also accused the daycare workers of leading them into a secret underground tunnel where they dressed as witches and flew around the air. Soon other parents started to claim that daycare was performing cannibalism, blood drinking, and sacrificing infants. After 7 years of investigations, the courts ruled no convictions as none of these claims were true. Also, no physical evidence was found on the children involving abuse. Their testimonies were influenced by the coercive questions led by the parents. This spawned multiple other situations throughout the country, having remarkably similar outcomes. When one says something like this, people are like sheep. They follow the herd so quickly without forming their own opinion on the matter, easily believing what one says or what the media claims is true. Like I said, SRA was just a shit excuse to use because no one wanted to be labeled with these heinous crimes, believing the work of the devil was responsible. I could go deeper into these trafficking rings and children abuse claims, but I want to save that for another series in the future, and to include the world of Epstein. In conclusion to all this, the Satanic Panic was nothing more than hearsay, word of mouth, and a group of sheep believing the claims. It's been proven that the satanic practice has nothing to do with what the people claimed it to be. I'm not saying though it's entirely innocent, as it did inspire a lot of horrific events like Manson, Richard Ramirez, and these pedophilia rings. Satanism is just a way of looking at life in a unique way, and these terrible people just use it as a lazy excuse to cover up how truly evil they are. So I'm going to stop here for now, as next week we will conclude this story with part 3. The final part, we will be looking at Satanism of today and the rise of the temples throughout North America. I'm going to put a couple links in the show notes I think you'll love to watch. One is an infomercial I think you'll enjoy about the Satanic Panic, and another about how Pokemon was the devil's work in the 90s. If you have any other stories you wish for me to cover in future episodes, feel free to email me at northernnightmares@outlook.com. Hit that subscribe button to get notified when new episodes drops, and I'll see you next week. Good night, and remember, nightmares are closer than you think.